Well, hello, welcome to Good Path Podcast. I'm your host, Chad Langerud, and I'm really excited to have Nneka Allen here with me today. Hey, Nneka.
Hey, Chad. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, so great. And we've gotten to know each other a bit, being a part of the same church here.
That's right.
And I really appreciated just getting to know you and hearing about some of the work you're doing. And I thought, man, it'd be great to have a conversation with you about your history and your work. I'll give a bit of your bio here.
Sure.
And just for people to get to know you a little bit. So Nneka Allen is a Black Afro-Métis woman, a mama, and a descendant of the Underground Railroad. Her ancestry includes African survivors of the transatlantic slave trade who built North America through both free and forced labor on stolen land. Over centuries, her freedom-seeking ancestors forged connections with the first peoples of Turtle Island, linking Nneka to her Cherokee and Lumbee heritage. As a relationship builder, stone catcher, freedom fighter, storyteller, and leadership coach, Nneka founded the Empathy Agency, where she joins clients in cultivating hope and destination within themselves, others, and the earth. And it's beautiful. I love the way you've articulated your story and your work. I'm going to read a little bit more just for some more context because you've got lots going on. You have been in the charitable sector and fundraising for 25 years.
Yeah.
You founded the Empathy Agency, which we just mentioned. You're a founder of the Black Canadian Fundraisers Collective.
I am.
Yeah. A group of fundraisers who inspire and elevate the philanthropic sector of the African tradition of Ubuntu. I am because we are. And you've been editing and part of authoring and editing books, collecting courage. And you were one of the first scholars in residence on equity, diversity, and inclusion at UBC. And you've been doing stuff. So
I've been a little bit busy. Yes.
Awesome.
Your gifts make room for you after all, right?
Yeah, for sure. So you've got a lot of really awesome experience and history and insight into a lot of what I'm excited about and growing in being people of empathy, being people of justice in the world today. And I feel like that's something that our society and our culture is needing more and more and more, it seems. And so I just think it's great to have a conversation with you today about that and learn some things about what you're doing. So why don't you give us a little bit more of an introduction to yourself and who you are and some of your history?
Sure. I mean, a lot of it is captured in my bio, and I do that on purpose because I think the more we lead with who we are rather than what we do, the potential for connection is greater. And also it gives people a line of sight into what shapes you. And I think all of that is really important when we seek to be in relationship with folks. And so I am a descendant of the Underground Railroad. And as such, my ancestors escaped slavery in the United States in North Carolina. My maternal family was in North Carolina, escaped into Amherstburg, Ontario, which is just about 20 minutes outside of Windsor. Amherstburg was a pretty busy spot for refugee slaves because it is the narrowest point on the Detroit River. And so refugee slaves could swim in the summertime and or walk across the ice in the winter to get to Canada. And so my ancestors didn't settle in Amherstburg because, as you can imagine, depending on the time that particular time, slavery was still in full effect in the United States, and it was a little too close for comfort. So they settled in Puce, which is on the other side of Windsor, and settled with the Ojibwe.
Yeah. Okay.
And started to build a life. And my great-grandmother was the keeper of a lot of that history and is one of the primary reasons, along with my Aunt Stella too, the primary reason why we know our history. We actually have an oral tradition, and then some of our relatives actually wrote about our family, and we have a family cemetery still, and also a National Historic Site in Puce on that same property where my Grandpa John and Grandma Jane settled when they escaped into Canada from slavery. The majority of my family lives in Windsor even today. I have one of the largest Black families in Windsor. Whenever I'm talking to family members, I can feel home.
Yeah.
It always feels good.
Yeah. Yeah, I've picked up from you a real deep value on belonging and tribe. Your
Absolutely. Well,
yeah.
when you come from a community that's so good at cultivating a sense of connection,
Mhm,
when you leave that community, for me, that's when it became so clear to me what richness exists
mhm,
within my family, but also in the broader Black community in Windsor. Windsor represents like the second oldest Black community in Canada.
really.
And so the majority of Black people who live in Southwestern Ontario are descendants of the Underground Railroad.
Mhm,
And that is distinct when you move across the country and you're looking at Black people. In Nova Scotia, you're looking at, Black Empire loyalists. In Windsor,
mhm,
in Essex County, in Kent County, which is Windsor, Chatham, Dresden, that area, you're looking at descendants of the Underground Railroad. And then by and large, across the rest of the country, you're looking at spatterings of those communities, but by and large, the Black community are newcomers or first, second generation immigrants.
So that has really shaped who you are and the work that you've undertaken, the path that you've taken. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your path in vocation and your path in your work?
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's interesting. So let me just start with, I'm a leadership coach. My career started in 1999, I guess, officially, and I fell into fundraising. I decided that I would take a job at a community museum in Amherstburg. It's today called the Amherstburg Freedom Museum. But in 1999, it was called the North American Black Historical Museum. And that museum keeps the history of my family and descendants of the Underground Railroad.
Mm,
And in 1999, there was a huge capital campaign happening because on the museum property are the Nazarene AME Church, and the other is the Taylor Log Cabin. Taylor Log Cabin is my mother's family. The Nazarene African Methodist Episcopal Church was built in 1848 by refugee slaves. And that edifice was in serious disrepair. And the city was saying it needed to be torn down unless it was restored. The restoration process for a building that old was no small matter. And so this capital campaign was started. It was an emergency capital campaign, in fact. And the community rallied. They ended up raising over $1 million to restore the church. I was hired as that campaign was kicking off to write the research report for the government. So there were multiple funders, but the federal government was one of the largest funders. And so one of the things that they required was a detailed research report about the history of the church, the history of the restoration, and then some storytelling around what that process was like. And so that was my job. And so I found myself in my early 20s, a young mom. I took the job. My father was vice president of the board at the museum. And I took the job because, my father thought it would be a good idea. And I liked the idea of working in the Black community, but had no idea that this would change my life. It would completely radicalize how I understood myself. And so I can remember walking into the room where I would do all my research for 6 months, boxes everywhere, and feeling very overwhelmed about where to begin. But once I got in there and started to really engage with these primary source documents, the history started to lift off the page, and I could see myself in it because I knew my story, and my story fit right into it.
mm,
And so I had this really fantastic sort of kicking off of my career, and nobody was calling anybody a fundraiser at this time. Although what I was doing was writing a stewardship report, frankly, right?
right.
But nobody was talking in those terms. So I didn't even think of myself that way. I just was doing work that I was really passionate about. And that campaign, that $1 million campaign, being a part of what the community can do when it comes together, showed me things I would never know otherwise, right?
Right.
And so I went on to become the assistant curator of that museum. And then 9/11 happened, and it completely transformed tourism.
Mm,
And so being in a border city, museums like this one,
mm,
the bulk of the visitors were coming
mm,
from the United States.
mm.
And so I ended up leaving the museum, and then I landed in healthcare and I started fundraising. This is when, the CEO of a mental health organization who wanted to hire me, he was the first person to say fundraiser to me. Have you ever thought about being a fundraiser? You're looking at my portfolio. And I said, well, no, but if it's all these things, then I guess I'm doing it. I'm already doing it.
Right.
And so that was the beginning of my formal fundraising career. And so then I went to school and I got certified in all of these things and went on for 15 years to inspire philanthropic investment in healthcare, both in mental health and then at a regional hospital. So regional healthcare. And the thing about that experience that brings me to today is the fact that I was always the only Black person in the room. I was the only person of color, woman of color in the room. Yeah. And I experienced all kinds of anti-Black racism. Yeah. And so that really forced me to the point of having to do something about it. So first doing something about it for myself. And thankfully I have a community of elders who, supported me in that process. But then what I started to notice was it wasn't just me. It was the young Black fundraisers coming up too, exact same stories. Mm-hmm. And so then I started to really look at the environment in the charitable sector and became very concerned. Mm-hmm. And then tried a number of different ways to sort of mitigate that, to no avail. And I call myself a reluctant entrepreneur because I never wanted to have my own business. Mm. But I realized in 2017 that I was going to have to do something more, do something myself. And so I had preemptively, a few years before that, gone back to school. I studied intercultural communications. And in 2018, in June, I took a step of faith and started the Empathy Agency. And I continued to work full-time at the time, part-time in the Empathy Agency, and I just started to build it. And I just really, I really had to trust God, literally. It's like, well, whatever comes into my path, I'm going to do what I need to do about that thing. I'm not going to worry about step 4, 5, and 6, right?
So at that beginning stage, who were you working with? Like when you started, what kind of people were you, or organizations were you like out of the gate? How did that look?
Healthcare.
Yeah.
Organizations.
Okay.
Yeah. And one of them is still my client today, actually.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they're a provincial organization. So first clients were in healthcare.
Yeah. And so give us a look about when you're working with this healthcare organization. What does it look like?
Yeah. So in this particular case, the work that I do with them, I provide the education for their provincial teams as it relates to racial justice. Okay, yeah. And so I have a training program called the Racial Equity Blueprint, and it is an exploration of the North American colonial project and our role in it. Mm-hmm. And that's really important because the average person is unfamiliar with that project. Mm-hmm. So first of all, they need to become aware of it. They have to then locate themselves in it, and then they need to situate their work in it so that they can begin to think about what behaviors support a more liberated world view, a more liberated world experience for everybody, right? And so the training is designed to guide those conversations and that learning. And so that's the primary work that I've done with them. And that is sort of evolved over 5 years.
So like in that context, this healthcare organization are they coming to you? Like, are they like noticing an issue? They're like, hey, we need to be more self-aware. We need to grow in this area, and who's going to help us? And then they're finding you. I guess you already had previous relationship with that at the beginning, or?
Well, this is really interesting. So in the case of these first organizations, I actually was at a conference and the CEO of one of the organizations was on a panel, and she's a white woman, and she was actually extremely honest. And it's rare that I see white leaders on a microphone tell the truth about what they don't know. Wow. And she did. And that got my attention. So afterwards, I spoke to her and we just started to connect. And I started to ask her, like, what is their organization? Where does she want to go with her organization or this? And so we built a relationship, and that's how that began. Now today, I think by and large it's referral. So it's people who know me, who have done work with me. We're telling other people. Also, I have a presence. As you know, I write. So people engage with that, and then they learn that I do more. And so they reach out to me through my website. And I would say those are probably the two primary ways. Well, like this too, podcasts, conversations, people listen and
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what's a snapshot of different types of organizations that you're working with? You're doing healthcare. I know you're doing some like primarily non-for-profit and education, or is it into the for-profit sector as well?
Into the for-profit sector as well. I would say the bulk of my clients are in the charitable sector because that's where I spent the bulk of my career.
Yeah.
But no, not exclusively. Like we've done the racial equity blueprint with like large mining companies. Yes. So into the nonprofit space too. I mean, into the for-profit space, but by and large, education and charities.
Yeah.
And not-for-profit.
Yeah. Yeah. Like the specific nature of what you're doing really caught my eye at the beginning because I work in the charitable sector as a church pastor. And I'm curious to know, like in your work, specifically with non-for-profits, what do you find is surprising to you? I'm interested to know about the dynamics that you're finding specifically in non-for-profit, power dynamics, non-for-profit. You've got a lot of great stories on your website where you're just seeing like, that racism or the power dynamics, who gets elevated and who doesn't. Can you speak to that a bit, what you're experiencing in these places, and what you have experienced?
So I think the number one thing we deal with this in Collecting Courage, that the charitable sector is like conferred this sort of status of goodness.
It's an assumption.
It's an inherent assumption, right?
We're
like,
on the right side. We're good.
You must be doing be doing the right. You do it. You care, right? Like, and so that absolutely obscures the truth about the behaviors that are happening. So I think that's really important. I think that prevents people from initially engaging around the truth of people's experiences inside charitable organizations. So that's probably the first hurdle, if people are completely unfamiliar. I also think, when organizations are doing good or perceived to be doing good, we don't want to say anything bad, or we don't want to acknowledge anything negative. I think that makes people feel uncomfortable. The Black Canadian Fundraisers Collective was born out of a need for brave, safer spaces for Black fundraisers to be, because their organizations are not that. And what it was then and what it is today is a gathering of Black fundraisers in a place that is loving and that cares about their wholeness, in a sector that does not love them in tangible ways. And that looks like all sorts of things. It looks like scrutinization of body language. It looks like discounting of people's work. It looks like not being paid the same as your counterparts. It looks like covert racism, overt racism that leaders then don't want to deal with. And then they turn around and make the problem you. Right. And what almost always happens when an issue of racism emerges is the Black fundraiser who's the victim has to leave the organization. They're either fired or they're forced out. And I've seen this over and over and over and over again. And so the collective has a whole bunch of sort of protective barriers so that we can help guide fundraisers around the jobs they apply for. We refuse to promote jobs from organizations we know have caused harm and have not repaired what they've broken. Right? We talk amongst ourselves. I've had members, on opposite sides of the country applying for the same job and like being treated really poorly. But because we're able to talk to each other about it, we can make better decisions about, I don't think this is the competition I want to be in, or I don't think this organized, something's weird going on here with this organization. And so our power is always in community.
Yeah. You talk about where this all comes from a bit, in terms of the term whiteness and a more foreboding term of white supremacy. Can we talk about that? I think because I would imagine that the people in these organizations probably have no concept that they're being racist, right? They probably would be very defensive about that idea. Like, of course I'm not racist, but I'm learning about this. Just the term whiteness doesn't have to do with the color of our skin, as it does a much wider and deeper kind of reality. And then that term white supremacy doesn't necessarily mean skinheads with not swastika tattoos, but a much more subtle belief that whiteness or white people are just better, culturally more competent, and it's very subconscious. Can you speak to that dynamic of just what whiteness means to you?
Yeah, it's subtle and it's subversive. So I like to say white supremacy culture.
Yeah, okay.
Because I think it offers greater accuracy around what we're dealing with. And if we look at what makes up culture, it's a myriad of things. It's not one thing, right? It's who our elders are. It's the displays on the wall. It's the uniforms we expect people to wear. It's the words we say. It's how we connect. It is literally everything around us, right? That's influencing, sending messages to us about what matters and what doesn't, or who matters and who doesn't.
And what's normal.
And what normal is. That's exactly right. And so the centrality of whiteness is designed to hide in plain sight. Right? And so the people who feel it most acutely are the people who live on the margins of society. Right? And so what is whiteness to me? Well, this is really interesting. So there's, white supremacy culture doesn't sit in isolation from patriarchy and capitalism. These things collude with one another to create the world we live in, right? And the central elements or let me say it this way, the central ways of being that uphold those three things are domination, exploitation, and control. Right. That's how North America began, right? Yeah. Domination through colonization, the removal and genocide of First Nations people, right? Exploitation, one example, chattel slavery, 400 years of slavery in the US, 200 years in Canada. There's no for forced-free labor of that magnitude anywhere in the world. So then we wonder, how come North America is so wealthy? Well, here. Yeah. Step one, steal the land, right? Put our culture on top of the culture that already lives here, right? And if they don't like it, kill them, wipe them away. Right? Bring in people to do all this manual work. Our current day stock market arises out of chattel slavery. And then control laws and policies that are designed to oppress and marginalize certain communities and concentrate power and wealth among a few. It is like it's
all baked in.
All baked in. And we see these three ways of being playing out even today. It doesn't look exactly like what I just described because it shapeshifts.
Right. Yeah, it's just the water we swim in, isn't it? Just the assumptions we make about the way things are, because that's just kind of how it was built. That seems really very depressing and sort of like okay, well, now what? You know what I mean? Like, yeah, like how do you like when we think like just the you get the results out of how things are designed to function, right?
Yes.
And if our world is, like we just live in a capitalistic society. We have our history of how things started, and we have like these assumptions about um, what's normal and what's
Hmm.
good and what's celebrated, and um, I don't know, like that it feels like it could be really hard work, Nika.
Well, it
Yeah,
is hard work. I mean,
yeah,
100% it is hard work. But I will say this, because I feel like the question you have is, where does hope live?
yeah. That's where I'm going. Yeah,
You know, hope has always lived in the communities most affected by this dominant culture. Because here's what's real. Just like I described to you where I came from, my people, the sense of belonging that I have, it's in my bones, it's in my DNA. It's because they baked it in.
hmm,
That's because I have a whole world that lives outside of dominant culture. And it's not just me, it's Black people generally, it's Indigenous people generally. There are whole worlds that live outside of
hmm,
this dominant culture that are robust and vibrant and alive and creative. And they know how to create another world, another way of being in this. Not even create, they are living another
yeah,
way of being
yeah,
in this world, right? And so hope is always in connection. But that's the number one thing that white supremacy culture, patriarchy, capitalism wants to steal: connection. As long as they can keep us disconnected, you will never know. Experience,
mm,
see, be a
mm,
part of that hope.
yeah. Yeah, no, I hear you. I think, yeah, like you talk about the power of storytelling and the connection and belonging and how that like sustains and builds a people and an identity and injustice. And I got to visit Rwanda a couple years ago, and going through the genocide memorials and some of those places where you read about how in Rwanda there was a different countries came in, but French and I think it's
Belgium.
Belgian colonizers came in and created the distinction between Hutu and Tutsi.
Mhm.
Like that just blew my mind, and just the power that dividing people has in subjugating them and like you said, domination and exploitation. So yeah, I'm hearing what you're saying, that fighting against people's connection can keep the other folks in charge and
That's
and
right.
and in power. And so how do you see that, like that happening in 2025, and like in centuries past, it was like colonizers coming in and physically like exploiting people and separating them ethnically and whatsoever. But what does that fight against connection look like today? How do you see it?
Oh, well, I mean, it is those same ways of being: domination, exploitation, and control,
Mhm.
right? And however they play out in the modern context, wherever you happen to be, right? And so, it's interesting. There's this real sort of attack on wokeness, which, you know, makes me laugh. It makes a lot of Black people laugh, because let's just think about what that is. Like, wokeness is really about being awake.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah,
And I know, I'm absolutely sure that in order for us to manifest more just communities, we have to be awake. We have to be awake to exploitation. We have to be awake to domination. We have to be awake to control, how it's moving, what it's doing.
hmm.
The option to sleep on that
Hmm.
sounds like privilege to me,
Hmm.
right? And
Hmm.
so the way language can be used to try to co opt, you know, people, I mean, that in itself is a case study.
Yeah,
But I think it's important for folks to really think about what people are talking about,
yeah,
right? Why in the world would we ever want to be asleep to
yeah.
oppression and
Wow.
suffering?
like
right?
a willful decision
Yes. A will.
to
Yes.
and to find ways to trivialize the notion of wokeness, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Because people don't want to be complicit in it. They don't want to be implicated in it. They don't want to be responsible for it either. But, there's this quote that I really love from the CEO of Essence, and her name is Caroline Wanga, and she wrote, I'm just going to read it. I think the future of activism is intrusive. It has no room for self-preservation, and it's measured by how the least of us are doing, not the best of us.
Mm.
So no matter how successful I am, if the person next to me is not as successful, then I'm not being the kind of activist I need to be. And I have to be prepared to give up something so that others can have some things.
Mm-hmm.
This is what I believe in: communal prosperity and wholeness. And so anything that sits in the face of that, anything that sits in the face of our human dignity, our right to be seen and to be loved and to belong, I got questions with that. And sometimes it's hard to intellectually understand what's happening in the moment, but we feel it in our bodies when it's happening, you know?
Yeah. So like thinking of like pushback that you've probably heard a million times, but that might enter people's minds listening, just like Canada. I don't know the actual statistics, but I would imagine that the majority of Canadian citizens are still European descent. Yeah. Or is it,
Yeah, maybe.
maybe?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So what I wonder if people think is, well, there is a majority of people who've like, doesn't culture just dictate what's kind of like normal? Doesn't the majority of, isn't it just, it is what it is to have a normal when most of the people here are white and European? If I went to another continent, wouldn't I experience the same thing where I'm not the normal? So why do other people feel like they need to have their normal in a different continent or a different country? You know what I mean? You know, hear what I'm
I get
saying?
exactly what
Yeah.
you mean.
So I wouldn't expect to go to China and feel like my Canadianness should be noticed. So why do you hear this kind of thing? And how do you respond to that sort of thing?
Well, a version of that I've heard. I'll say more about that. But let me just deal with this question. So this question negates colonization. It omits that
Right.
it omits that this
Sure.
is not your land. You know what I mean? It censors whiteness and says, "Oh, this is where we're from."
Yeah. Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
no, no. You
Yeah.
came and put your culture on top of a whole nation of people.
Yeah.
Those people still here too, right?
Yeah.
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 And
Good.
so, but that's the strategy of it. And that's the other part. There's a strategy to this. If people are unaware of the history, if people don't understand themselves in the context of the history, then they'll ask questions like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you're always coming from a place of primacy, like we've just always been here. This is us, right?
Yeah. And we deserve to be here, right?
Right. Right.
Yeah. And we see this push against immigration right now, which I have been super fascinated by, just from a coaching perspective, looking at it to understand like what is going on there. And I'll just be really plain. I mean, we see it not just here in Canada, we see it in the United States, and that is really about fear, the fear of being a quote minority. It's white fear about becoming a minority. What will that mean for me?
Well, I mean, I feel like that's what Donald Trump has like completely run on the whole time
He sure has.
is like tapping into that fear of being displaced and
Mm-hmm.
immigrants taking our jobs and taking our spot and yeah.
And fear is a huge barrier to justice.
Mm-hmm.
We all engage with fear differently, but I would say by and large, the average person, when afraid, does what? Hide, run, as opposed to leaning in or trying to see their way through it. Engaging courage, which is a practice, not just an idea.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, fear never does anything good for us.
Mm.
which is why I've been so frustrated with the politics these days of fear. Um,
Yeah.
you're right. It doesn't lead us anywhere good, anywhere holistic. It just keeps dividing us.
I believe the opposite of fear is love.
Mm. This is what it's all about, isn't it, really? This is what it comes down to.
It absolutely is. Empathy is the precursor to love. And so, what is our love practice on a daily basis to really stave off or at least respond to the fear?
Mm.
And the most love I've ever experienced has always been in community, whether it be my family, communities I create myself, communities I belong to, I've been invited into, always.
Our world is built with individualism as the value, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Where we all create a little castle, a little empire, and I have my home, I have my savings and retirement plan, I have my
Mm-hmm.
budget, and I just we just our imagination is filled with that's the way things are. And
Mm-hmm.
so for you, I hope things go well for you, right? But if they don't, what am I going to do about that? 'Cause
And what do we tell ourselves is the
Mhm.
reason why people don't do well? They didn't
Well,
work.
they haven't worked hard enough, or they pulled themselves up by their bootstraps or whatever,
That's right.
which is built on the assumption that everybody is starting out with the same deck of cards, right?
That's exactly right. And it also assumes that our success or our progress is hard fought individually, which is
Mhm.
false.
Right.
Which
Yeah.
is false. We are absolutely connected, whether we want to acknowledge it or not, whether
Mhm.
we want to be or not. We are. And we can honor that and then do something really powerful or continue to kill ourselves by trying to stay disconnected.
Mhm.
So much of that disconnection is related to the drug epidemic we see
Yeah.
unfolding,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Addiction comes from disconnection.
That's right.
Yeah. And we're addicted to all kinds of things.
All kinds of
Yeah.
things.
Yeah. I wanted to ask your thoughts on this, but I've been observing the vilifying of empathy.
Mm,
And over the last several years, I've just been really becoming more and more fascinated with the idea of empathy and the practice of empathy and being sort of this hidden superpower in the world
mhm,
that's super connected to our faith because Jesus became a human being.
mhm,
So Jesus left the throne of heaven to come and become a human being. And the most comprehensive act of empathy, and the scriptures say that he experienced human life the same as we. He suffered in every way that we do, so
mhm,
that we can call on him. And there's a book of Hebrews, we can call on him, and because he's our brother,
mhm,
and he can identify with us in every way, and he knows, and he can respond to our request for help.
mhm.
So this notion of empathy is totally like wrapped up in the gospel message that this is how the world is saved,
Yeah.
is through it, the empathetic move of God in becoming small.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
so I've been really fascinated with, like, theologically and in response to the way our world is, that the division and the polarization of us politically and religiously and socially, it's just the divide's growing wider and wider and wider.
Mhm,
And because we just create demons of the other side, right? And we
mhm,
don't step into their shoes. We don't think about, oh, how did you get to where you got,
mhm.
and seek to understand. And so anyway, I've just been really like fascinated and more convicted that empathy is what bridges the divide. And now when I hear that empathy is got a target on its back by a lot of folks, I'm horrified. And I wonder, are you seeing that too?
I think there's a full on attack on on love And I mean, those things are connected. And I think, as I said, empathy is a precursor to love. But I think that, when people are having these conversations, there's a lack of understanding about the types of empathy that exists, right? There's effective empathy, which is really that idea of trying to, put on the shoes of another person, which is almost impossible in some ways, right? Versus cognitive empathy, which is about perspective taking, which is really powerful, even more powerful than effective empathy, because it's kind of really hard to do. But perspective taking has the potential to really stretch us, just catapult us out of what we believe is real.
So what is that? What is perspective empathy?
So perspective taking is so it often comes through relationship, right? Being proximate. I don't know if you're familiar with Brian Stevenson's work, Just Mercy. He wrote a fantastic book. There's a movie about
Just Mercy. Yeah, I'm familiar with that.
Yeah. And so, he talks about needing to be proximate to the people suffering, right? And when you are, you can engage cognitive empathy. You can begin to understand their perspective, right? You don't have to have the same experience, but because we're both human, if you're able to start to see the world through their eyes in a sense, or you're able to see the world from their position, that's taking a different perspective. So even in coaching, for instance, one of the things we do if our clients are stuck, we'll ask them to get up, like go to a different part of the room and ask the same question over again. Now, what do you see? And even that works, right? And so there's no scenario by which I could agree with anybody saying that empathy is on its way out. No, we don't need this anymore, especially from that perspective of taking another person's perspective. I mean, a lot of the conversations I'm having right now, particularly around this political circumstance, both in the United States and its mirror image here in Canada, is literally about perspective taking. And I've been saying to folks, if you only are on your phone looking at these things through social media, then the algorithm is telling you what you want to hear. Whereas if you are connected to real people living in real places around this world, you will have different perspectives that help shape your understanding of what's going on. Right?
Yeah, because then it's not an issue, right? It's not a position.
That's right.
It's people, right? It's human beings. And if you know them, if they have a name and if they have a face, then whether it's you're talking about Ukraine or Gaza or the Mexico-US border or whatever it is, you can't just make a hard line, bottom line position on it without taking into consideration human beings and lives and stories.
That's exactly right. And you also have an experience in that. So I'll just give you a quick experience. So I belong to this group called Co-Conspirators, and it's a global, multiracial, multigendered group of activists. And one of our members is German, and they just had an election. And I don't know if you followed what was going on there, but there's been this real move to the far right.
Yeah, in Germany. Yeah.
And so the day after the election, she was trying to share with our group on WhatsApp a video about what was happening. And nobody in North America could see it. She kept trying to send it. And then we realized it's being censored. That experience, nobody can tell me that censorship's not happening. Do you know what I mean? We experienced it in real time.
Wow.
And so when we think about being awake, it becomes like really important, like super important to literally maintain an awake posture to what's going on around us.
I think to me, it comes back to fear, right? Fear and love. Like, we shouldn't be afraid to ask questions about ourselves and our assumptions and our upbringing. And it comes back to just love asking, like, what am I not aware of that I need to be aware of for the sake of someone else? That the whole thing about being woke is like, what do I need to wake up to in order to be more loving, right? Because I got blind spots. I got assumptions that I see things that are just baked into my experience that maybe aren't true or maybe are racist.
Yeah. Well, you remember one of the last times we met, I asked you, who were you before you became white, or who was your
Yeah.
family before
Good
they
one.
became white? And that I asked that question to most people, most white people I know, as a starting place for them to begin to even contemplate what that answer might be. That's really important because the reality is the awake posture is first for you, for us, like me too, right? So how are we awake to who we actually are, who
Mm,
we truly are,
mm,
right? For white people, that's a particular journey because whiteness is a social construct.
mm,
And there's a club of whiteness that is used to inspire you to remain, quote, white.
mm,
The work I do with my clients, my white clients in particular, is a journey out of whiteness and a journey into something more real and more true
mm,
about who they are. And
mm,
that's really important to discover because you will never trade whiteness for nothingness. You will only trade it for something that is more real, that is
mm,
more authentic, that is more tethered to your humanity.
mm.
And when you get there, when you start to wake up to that, there's nobody who could ever convince you to go back to sleep, which means you then become more awake to the people around you.
Yeah. Yeah. So what's next for you? What are you up to next? What are you kind of leaning into in the next little bit here?
Yeah. So I'll be doing more writing. I've recently started a Substack and
Okay.
which has taken off. I just hit 100 subscribers today,
Nice.
actually.
Nice.
So I'll be doing more writing. And I think that's really important because this is the 5th anniversary of Collecting Courage. And the editors and I have been talking about, what does that mean for our work? And one of the things that we're very clear about is the necessity of documenting what is happening in the world and in our lives right now, particularly as Black women. So for that reason, I'll be doing more writing and I'll be
Mm-hmm.
doing the bulk of it through Substack, although it will also be on my website, mainly now through subscription. So that'll be a big piece.
Nice.
Coaching will always be the heart of my work. One-on-one
Yeah.
coaching is really where it's my favorite place to be because I believe that all change begins with the individual. And
Mm, mm,
so much can actually happen in that one-on-one exchange. And so
mm,
I try to reserve 50% of my calendar for clients one-on-one.
mm, mm.
And then, of course, the racial equity blueprint,
Yeah.
continuing to do that training.
Yeah.
I just like being in those spaces with folks. And then I facilitate at UBC,
Yeah.
racism strategies in the workplace. So
Yeah.
that'll continue. And just being open to what the next steps for the empathy agency might look like.
What's the best way for people to find you and if they want to see more about what you're doing and look you up?
Yeah. So my website, so theempathyagency.ca. You can book a discovery call with me right there on the website if you want to know more about coaching. If there's something else you're interested in, you can fill out the form and be in touch with me there. They can also find me on Blue Sky and on Substack.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
so leaving there and
Nice. Nice. And I'll just testify that you are a great and generous and gracious person to talk about these things with. Appreciate all our conversations, and your heart is really is good, and it's for people, and I really appreciate the spirit with which you do what you do, and just being able to serve and work together at our church and in our community a bit is really a gift to me.
I love that. Thank you so much for
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
I'm glad that you stepped out and asked me. I'm looking forward to whatever conversations we have in the future.
Yeah. Same here. Okay. Thanks so much, Nneka.
Thanks, Chad.